lot, basically. And when I saw two beautiful mushrooms down at St. Lawrence Market, and I investigated how they were grown, I found out that they were grown outdoors on oak logs. So I said, well, this could be the perfect pastime for me. And that was a few years ago, and now I'm in it full time. So
you want to explain to me the cultivation process of these mushrooms?
Okay, there are two basic techniques for growing shiitake mushrooms. One is outdoors on oak logs, or any hardwood log actually, but oak is the most preferred species. It was developed in this form by the Japanese just after the war. The other technique is to grow them on hardwood sawdust indoors in a climate-controlled room. Most of the ones that you see in the supermarkets these days are indoor-grown shiitake. It's a lot easier to grow them indoors than it is outdoors, a lot less labor. And I can go through the different techniques for you and show you exactly how it's done. What Rolly is going to do is drill a series of holes in this oak logs. Depending on the size of the log, that will depend how many holes you drill. In this particular size, only a couple of rows of holes would be necessary. Okay, at this point we're going to introduce the mycelium, the spawn, into those holes. There you go, Rolly. We use a hand plunger and we fill it with approximately 1.5 inches of spawn, and then we push it into the holes that have been drilled. What will happen here is the mycelium on the sawdust will jump off onto the log itself and will colonize the full log in about 1 year.
So it takes about 1 year?
It takes 1 year in our climate before you get any mushrooms coming out of these logs. That's probably good enough there, Rolly. Just now we have to seal the holes with melted wax. This will prevent the mycelium from drying out, the spawn from drying out. And after this is done, we just put the log itself out in the bush. This is suitable for a small number of logs. If you're doing thousands of logs, for example, in a commercial operation, you may want to use an inoculating machine such as this one. What this machine does is it does two jobs. After you drill the holes, you put the spawn in there and use an air compressor to introduce the spawn into the holes, at the same time sealing it with a piece of styrofoam. These machines were developed by the Japanese. And you can do, even with the hand waxing operation, you could easily do, a couple of people can do 100 logs a day. Well, depending on the size. If you get 12-inch logs, it could be somewhat difficult.
So do you get one mushroom per hole?
The first year you'll get the mushroom popping out of the inoculation site because that's the easiest spot. Afterwards, once the bark has softened, the mushrooms will pop out anywhere on the log. This log, once you've introduced the mycelium into the log, if you keep it in the shade and keep it and every once in a while you keep it moist, the mycelium will survive in there and produce mushrooms until it's used up all of the nutrients in the log. You do not have to reintroduce it into the log. And this particular log here will last approximately 3 years. The bigger the diameter of the log, the longer it will last and produce mushrooms.
What are some of the disadvantages of harvesting mushrooms like this? Is there any problems with the weather?
The main problem is if it rains. Once you have some nice mushrooms popping out of the sides and it pours, then the mushroom will absorb the water and get a bit soggy. Otherwise, shiitakes are not really bothered by any pests. There are some slugs, but it's just a minor problem. Insects don't bother them, and wildlife doesn't seem to like eating them.
Does it get affected by frost or cold weather?
They can freeze at night. There are cold weather species that actually only produce in the spring and the fall. They get the best quality mushrooms. They freeze at night, and then they keep growing the next day, and they produce a really nice, solid, fleshy mushroom. In the summer, you'll get mushroom growing very quickly, and you produce a very thin, fleshed mushroom.
So when is harvesting time for these type of mushrooms?
You can harvest anywhere from late April up until November. There are, like I said, different strains that fruit at different times of the year. Cold weather strains, multi-rain strains, and hot weather strains.
So you're growing them and you're seeding, or I guess you would call this in a sense seeding, all year round?
No, you do this in the spring. You get your logs cut in the winter. As soon as it warms up, you inoculate the logs like I've just shown you, and then you put them out in the bush. Once you've gotten your log population up to what you want, let's say a couple of thousand logs or a couple hundred or 10,000, then you would only do the inoculation for about 20% of the logs, because the logs average, their lifespan is an average of about 5 years.
What's the highest cost when cultivating these mushrooms?
If you have to purchase the wood, it's one cost. The spawn is another, and labor, of course.
So once you've done this process, what happens next? Do you want to show me what?
Yes, I'll take you over to my laying yard where these logs sit for 1 year in the shade.
Let's go take a look.
After the logs have matured and they are actually producing mushrooms, I keep them in two spots. One is in a regular bush area, and one is under this artificial ginseng shade. To produce mushrooms, you have to either soak the logs or you have to give them water. You can't really depend on the rainfall to produce them, otherwise they can pop out whenever they want. To get a consistent production schedule, I take my logs and I put them in these frames over here, and then I soak them in a tank. The smaller logs, I soak them in tanks. In the other section that I have the larger logs, and I have a sprinkler system set up for those because they're a bit heavy to move. Once you've soaked the logs for about 24 hours, a couple of weeks go by and the mushrooms start to pop out. Once you pick the flush of mushroom, you let the logs sit and recover. The mycelium will digest more of the wood, and 2 months after that you can re-soak the log and get another crop out of it. So in one season you could actually get 3 crops. And if you have a greenhouse, a heated greenhouse, you can actually bring the logs indoors in the winter and go from there. You can produce a crop in the winter as well.
So you were mentioning before we were talking about animals. Do you have problems with that?
No, shiitake are not bothered by pests. Deer don't bother them. You may get the odd squirrel that's hungry in the springtime. I have a bit of slug activity